Hello there everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Joesephyr and welcome to another Should You Pull video for Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia. Now in today's video we're going to be talking about Eald'Narche's banner. Now Eald'Narche is a character that I've grown very fond of in Final Fantasy Dissidia at least, and even though I haven't played the game that he comes from, which is 11, because of his unique playstyle, the fact that he changes his moveset after he uses certain moves, the fact that he's got like unique debuffs and things like that no one else really has. There's a lot of uniqueness about him, but how valuable is that uniqueness in this new era with his new LD, and maybe even the slight tweaks to his LD that are being made, that were at least mentioned within the community stream, and what could that tweaking actually be? So if you'd like to learn more about Eald'Narche and the event that comes along with him, then as always, stay tuned and keep on watching. As always, before we get started, don't forget to check all of the social media links in the description box below, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and Patreon. On Twitch, we finally finished Final Fantasy 3 for Final Fantasy Count Up every Friday night, so the next stop is going to be Final Fantasy 4, which is one I've been very excited to play because it's one of the few I've never ever played. And it's one that has a lot of characters that I really love, so I'm really looking forward to playing that one. And it's going to be the Steam/DS version, so it might be a little bit different, because I know a lot of people play the PSP one, but I thought I'd go with the 3D one. With regards to Patreon, obviously I shout out one of my patrons every time I release a video, and today that person is going to be Zypress, who has been a follower of mine for quite some time, so a massive shout out and thanks goes out to you. And if you'd like a title card just like Zypress has, and you'll notice that their title card actually has Zexion from Kingdom Hearts in there as opposed to a Final Fantasy character, so you don't necessarily have to pick a Final Fantasy character if you don't want to for your title card, then perhaps you might like to join in with Patreon and get other benefits as well, such as joining in with voice chats. We had one last night and I actually pulled Gabranth LD while I was on that chat, so people apparently gave me luck, so thank you for that guys. As well as being involved with the Would You Pull portion of the videos, then perhaps you might want to consider becoming a patron yourself and continuing to support the channel further, so thank you very much if you do. Don't forget to check out all of the other links in the description box below for all things related to Dissidia Opera Omnia, and of course don't forget to check out all the other content creators out there besides myself. Okay, so now let's take a look at the banner and then Eald'Narche and what his LD brings, and perhaps give a quick rundown on those of you that may not have used him before, because he's a pretty complex character. But before that, let's take a look at the banner itself. Of course, it's going to contain all of Eald'Narche's gear, so his LD, his EX, his 15, his 35. It's going to have another chance to get Emperor's Burst, and Lord knows I need more chances to get Emperor's Burst. And it's also going to feature Garnet and Lana Rain's EXs as well. Now, if you've not used Eald'Narche before, he's quite a complex character in that he actually has two movesets. When you've given him his C55 and 60 and his 1535 CP weapon and all of that said, he starts with his exoplates. Now the exoplates buff reduces the bravery and HP damages he takes by half, and it means that he's got 100% debuff evasion as well, and if he dies, or if he would die, instead of dying he gets his health fully restored and he dispels the exoplates. But his moves while he has the exoplates are weaker than they would be if he didn't have them. You can choose to remove the exoplates yourself, which most people tend to do, by using the phase shift attack, which is a like an AoE brave HP attack that does 100% damage and doesn't consume ability use, doesn't consume a turn, anything like that, but you then get different versions of his skills. So exoplates become, or phase shift, sorry, becomes Stellar Burst, and then Uranos Cascade, which ordinarily is just a brave HP attack with 50% splash damage that gives him his Mulled Cunning buff, which is just an offensive buff that enables his brave HP plus, basically. Gives all the enemies an attack down debuff, and then you go, that's pretty much all that is. But once you've gotten rid of the exoplates, you get Stellar Burst and Omega Javelin. Now, Stellar Burst is actually the more basic of the two at that point, which is the one replacing Phase Shift, because it's a 5-hit AoE Brave HP attack with split damage that gives speed down to all enemies, which is nice, but nothing particularly special. Omega Javelin is a 5-hit Brave HP attack that does 50% splash damage, but also gives you access to the Warp debuff. Now, Warp is a very, very strong thing that you get from that, in that you get a, basically similar to how Realm works with her sketch. So what you get from that is that you end up being able to take your turn immediately after theirs for a free turn after your enemy is acted, and it doesn't count towards the turn count or anything. So you'll get free skills or free HP pluses, etc. every time you want to use one of these skills. So warp, and you get a defense down buff to boot as well. So basically the idea of him without his EX is that he can take a lot of turns after your opponent's does and kind of sneak extra turns in and extra damage in. His C65 actually helps with this quite a lot as well, because it makes it, while you have the buff up, the duration of the debuffs you inflict lasts for extra turns. And this is going to come into play when we talk about his LD in a little while as well, because it gives free skill uses, and chances are some people are going to want to use it on the C65 because it means that the warp debuff that you're getting is going to last longer, because normally it only lasts for 2 turns, whereas you'd make it last longer. And it also factors into his EX as well. Now his EX is also an interesting one because it's another like AoE full HP damage, brave HP, and it's basic as anything without putting any kind of with the exoplates on. If you don't have the exoplates, it has it becomes Vortex Plus, which means it does more damage, and you get the Terror debuff off of it. Now Terror makes it so that the enemy takes more damage from Eald'Narche, but it also means that if they are targeting Eald'Narche or everyone, including Eald'Narche, they can't move. They don't do anything. It's like paralysis. They can't actually do anything at all, and it works really well. So then when you put your Power Stones and your Ingots and things like that into the EX, you get an HP plus variant that gives you a 3-hit Brave HP that keeps your Mull Cunning buff longer, going, so you don't have to worry about refreshing it all that much. And you also get Terror off of using Phase Shift to take the exoplates off, or if you let him die and then resurrect himself. Vortex Plus then just gets more damage, and then you get more stats out of it. But the combination of Warp and Terror is what you're looking for when it comes to Eald'Narche. The extra debuffs are nice, but they're unframed debuffs. They can be replaced by other things. Obviously, if you have the room to have all of his debuffs on there, which with his ELD becomes 6, then great. But what you're really looking for is Terror and Warp. So Terror actually is a lot stronger than it used to be, on the back of level 80 and the ability to call. Now, the reason I say that is because if you have call abilities like Celes or anything like that that had the lock keyword on them, or lock debuff, you can lock enemies onto Eald'Narche while the Terror debuff is on them, and then guarantee that those enemies are not going to be able to do anything. And a lot of people have said, like, oh yeah, but Terror gets resisted by a lot of things, and you know, it does get resisted by some things, but not nearly as many as people make it out to be. Like, I was looking through, Rem's Lufenia record, so big shout out to you. And there actually aren't that many enemies that outright resist Terror for quite a while, so there is that. Now, going on to the LD. Now, Exceed Lance, as it is a bit meh. Like, it's alright, it's not anything special. It's a Brave HP attack with split damage, like double, like, so you get like you summon these like big crayons that do like alternating bravery attacks and then do a brave HP attack, and it also has like multiple HP dumps into it, so 3 HP dumps once you put the LD boards, but I'll get to the LD boards in a second and I'll explain why in a moment. And then you get a debuff called Nourishment for Paradise. So with all of the other debuffs, he takes up 6 slots. And Nourishment for Paradise is just reducing their defenses and giving him sap, which, cool. It's something. It's nothing major, and you get a free skill use on like the next turn. Like you get, you know, you can use the C65 to make it so your Warp and Terror lasts longer, or you can get a free use of his Warp of Omega Javelin to put the Warp down. You know, having free skill use is nice. You do only get 3 uses of this though, so it's like, as it stands, it doesn't really do a lot. It does decent damage as long as you don't have the exoplates on, although you might want to use it early, and again, I'll get to that in just a moment, because there's reason it doesn't do an awful lot of damage unless the exoplates are off. It does okay damage. It's still triple bravery, it's a triple HP, it's fine, it's just nothing special. Now, the LD board for this is interesting because, as they said on the community stream, there's a tweak to Eald'Narche's LD coming that we didn't necessarily expect. Now, when Eald'Narche got his burst later, like much later on, he got a rework to his LD board. So as you can see here, the full rework is that you get Warp off of using Exceed Lance, You also get a buff from Eald'Narche called Eald'Narche, which gives him more Brave Overflow, gives him a Brave regen, and makes it so that he does more bravery damage depending on how many debuffs the enemies have on them. Well, those weren't originally there. Now, originally, when all you really got from the LD board was more damage, like the triple HP dump from the Eald'Narche plus. You got a bit of extra ability, effects on the nourishment for Paradise. You didn't get anything. You didn't get the buff. You didn't get the warp. And honestly, that buff helps Eald'Narche a lot. So if it turns out that that is the tweak that they're referring to, it does make him a lot more desirable, because the problem that Eald'Narche has is that he doesn't have multiple HP dumps on anything except for his LD, but he does take loads of free turns that don't add to your turn count through the warp debuff. That if you got sap and a brave regen on top of it, and then the brave damage being increased, etc., his damage output might not be as bad as it looks. Like it doesn't look great for this period in time. Like when you're looking at characters like your Squalls, your Lightnings, and even like debuffers. Like there's other debuffers that do just as well as with damage as well, but Eald'Narche's value is that having the Terror buff and the Warp debuff mean that your opponents just can't move, they can't do anything, and there are certain fights in which you can really abuse that and use it to your advantage, particularly if you have strong call abilities that have access to the debuff as well, so that you can make sure that Terror is going to do what you want it to do, and you can keep up with it because you get the free skill uses, things like that. But I don't think at any point Eald'Narche is a mandatory character for anyone, because there's a lot of characters that can do a lot of debilitating things. I really enjoy Eald'Narche, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be for everybody. Now, call ability wise, Eald'Narche is okay. He does have the defense down on his regular Omega Javelin. It removes exoplates on both of his calls just because it means you get the plus version of Eald'Narche and Omega Javelin rather than Uranus Cascade. But it's a splash damage attack that puts defense down on the enemies and gives you some offensive stats, which is okay. And then Eald'Narche Plus gives you the triple HP dump, and it also gives you the Nourishment for Paradise debuff, so you get the sap and the defense down. So if you stack one on top of the other, it's fine. But because Eald'Narche doesn't really have anything when he comes in, like Caius or characters like Gabranth or anything like that, you don't get the meat of what you want. You don't get warp from either of them. You don't get Terror because it's on his EX. You don't get a lot of that stuff, unfortunately, through the call abilities. But there's a nice amount of damage there, and you get you do get the defense down on top of it. Now, Eald'Narche's armor is obviously Tactics Keystone. Now, Tactics Keystone is a nice one to have on anyone that can run it, and I do think that it's valuable on Eald'Narche because it reduces their defense further, which is a lot of what his debuffs do, and having their attack go down on top of it, it's a nice one to have. And if you're going to use Eald'Narche frequently, then you probably would want to take this as well. Artifacts-wise, he has a C50 that raises his offensive stats while he doesn't have exoplates, and you want to tack on him. You definitely want to tack on him for as much as possible, because even if he does have this Brave regen and all the extra stuff that comes on top of the LD board rework, you want to make as much damage as you can with those HP pluses, so you're not having to revert to using skills during his warp turns. So the reason, he takes a while to explain, does Eald'Narche, but what you really want from him are the warp warp debuff, the Terror debuff, and the fact that you get free turns and can just throw out HP pluses, with decent amounts of debuffs, sap, this Brave regen if we get it. The buff, I think, the Eald'Narche buff, if we get it early, because we didn't originally get it until Eald'Narche's burst came out, because he does get a burst later on, and that might be a reason for you to perhaps consider pulling or not pulling either way. Maybe you're like me and you like pulling for the LDs the first time around so that you don't have to the next time. Or maybe you're happy to just pull them together, or maybe you're just not planning on pulling on Eald'Narche's burst at all. So maybe that's a factor for you. He's accompanied by Noel, I believe. So maybe that could be a factor into whether you want to pull on those characters as well. So now let's take a look at Eald'Narche's Lost Chapter and the event that we can expect, or the Lufenia mission that we can expect to see here. So this time around we're going to be fighting against a Lufhorn, which is a variant on the bugs that we fought, not the moth monsters that we fought during Renoa's missions, things like that. But it's a variant on that actually, if you play this properly, can be really tricky, because the enemy is immune to being delayed while ads are present. So the idea is that you take Eald'Narche along and try to make it so, yeah, sure, they're not able to have their turns delayed, but I can take loads of them because of the ads and the main boss just taking loads of turns because they can shuffle their turns around each other. And the ads get re-summoned every 10 turns after they're killed, so you want to try and make sure that you're able to deal with that. However, the most common way of dealing with this particular fight is to just stop the boss from ever resummoning the ads, because while the enemy is immune to paralysis, he's not immune to the framed paralysis that Ramuh can bring. Now, obviously, Ramuh level 40 has a paralysis attached to him, and while the boss is paralyzed, he can't resummon the ads. So what a lot of people do is they'll fight normally until the point where the enemy is on his, or the boss is on his own, the ads are dead, then summon Ramuh, get the paralysis, and then delay him to heck and back because he can now be delayed because the ads aren't there. That's the usual way to deal with it. But like I said, if you are pulling for Eald'Narche and you want to use him, he's obviously very strong here. Aerith is used a lot here as well because the enemies like to buff with shields and like a lot of bravery, things like that. They like to buff themselves a lot, and Aerith will prevent that. Similarly, if you want to, you can bring Balthier along so that you can like steal them, or Arciella can come along and also dispel them. Now, Arciella and Kefka get a strong mention here because the bosses aren't immune to HP silence either, so you could just take one of those guys along, and then that way you don't really have to worry about getting HP attacked, and therefore the only thing you really have to worry about is the Lufenia Orb, which is actually a very simple Lufenia Orb as well, because as long as their bravery is under 10k, then the count goes up. But honestly, with the delay tactics, they never get to get the Lufenia Orb in the first place because it only appears after they use target lock release, which is one of their sort of attacks, as it were. So they have to actually get a turn in order to be able to get the orb. So if you want to, you can just abuse that in multiple different ways, whether it be Cloud Kyson Lightning or Ramza Lightning, or like any kind. Lightning gets used a lot in this because they're not immune to lightning. They are, however, immune to Holy and Dark, so I wouldn't suggest bringing along Paladin Cecil if I were you. And then like Onion Knight gets used for this as well. You can use Onion Knight to abuse the fact that you get your turns before they do. You can use Ramza. Like Ramza as a friend unit is always strong because of the fact that you get the launch, the delay, a decent amount of damage, that sort of thing. You just want to make sure you're keeping on top of them as best that you can. They do also have a nasty brave damage reduction, which you're supposed to dispel. Like as I said, you can take along your Balthier, you can take along Arciella or Aerith. There's a lot of characters that work really well here, and if you can if you take Kefka, you can frame all of your debuffs on them so they never get the ability to put buffs over the top of them. So it's tricky if you're like trying to do it properly, but it's a very abusable Lufenia mission if you want to try and do it that way. So now we come to the big question of the video, of course. Should you be pulling for Eald'Narche's LD at this time? Because it does return later with a burst. Now, I quite like getting hold of LDs the first time they come around in the hopes that I don't necessarily have to pull for their LD when their bursts do come around. This would have happened for Garland and Ultimecia if they were nice to me the first time round, but sadly they weren't. And I grabbed Emperor LD for this very purpose, and some people might find that the same is true of Eald'Narche. Now, I do think a lot of this hinges on whether we get that LD board tweak / rework early, as was insinuated in the community stream, and I'd be interested to see exactly how that goes. Because if we do get it, and it's not something that's tied intrinsically to the burst weapon as well, like when that comes in a few months' time, then it makes him significantly more appealing. Because without it, his damage is pretty lackluster. He doesn't do a large amount of damage. He needs brave regen, otherwise you're having to use skills during the warp turns, which isn't great, and you end up burning through everything. And if you don't get warp off of the LD attack as well, it means you have to burn exoplates early in order to benefit from warp as much as you can, and it would make a massive difference to him. So if he doesn't have that, it does make him a lot less appealing. However, Terror and Warp are a thing. Like, Terror is actually a very powerful debuff, especially if you've got access to the right calls that go along with him. Celes, for example. Because there are, like, having looked through, if you look through Rem's, like, Lufenia database or Tonberry Troops Lufenia database, all the ones that I show on my channel here, which I do encourage you to do so, by the way, if you haven't been already, go and check those guys out. You'll notice there actually aren't as many enemies that resist Terror as you might think. Like, so therefore he could be brought along to a more wide range of a fight than you first might have thought. And he does have very unique gameplay. Like, if you want to grab it now and you want to make it so that you've got access to it ready for when his burst comes out, that's 2 weeks of synergy. Like, that's 2 weeks of an easier time because you already have that available to you. And if you are interested in Null, or you're happy to go for his LD later and you're not really that fussed about Null, then maybe you don't really want to pull for it here. He also only has one attack that has multiple HP dumps. You could argue because he has Warp that he gets a lot of HP attacks all at once, but again, I think that that's going to hinge on that rework, whether that happens or not. And then we've got other characters that do HP silence, things like Kefka and Arciella. We have control-based debuffers already, even Cloud with paralysis, like Kryl, Ramu now. Like, there's a lot of ways to stop your opponent taking a turn. You may not feel the need for Terror. I quite like it. I like Eald'Narche's kit. I think it's unique. And I'm still chasing Emperor's Burst, so I'm probably going to throw some tickets at it. But I don't necessarily think that everyone else will want to. And then finally, it's time for Would You Pull, the section of the video where you, the viewer, get your chance to make your voice heard and let everyone know whether you would or wouldn't pull on any banner and why. So once again, a massive thank you goes out to all of my patrons who have casted their votes and their comments as to whether they're going to pull on Eald'Narche or not. And this is definitely a lot more on the leaning no side than the last few banners have been. So to go into the numbers, of course, 6% of people said that they were going to use gems on this banner, 22% of people said they were going to use 100 or more tickets on it, 42% said they were going to use 100 or less tickets on it, and 31% of people said that they weren't going to pull here at all. Now, let's also not forget that there is actually a free pull on this banner, and honestly, I would like for a win at some point game. So if you want to give me Eald'Narche or even Empress Burst, I'd love you for it. I don't see it happening, but we can be hopeful. But let's go into some of the comments and see what other people have to say. So Sakuraba Neku says 100 plus tickets here. By himself, his debuffs make him fun to play with and open up interesting strategies. Cough, cheese, cough. And even if between now and his burst he doesn't get many chances to shine, having the LD perform will be useful for future planning. Also, the multi-crayon attack is always fun to look at. It is a very odd looking attack. I'll just say that now. Like, you get like a prism of stalactite crystals that he just throws at alternating enemies and then they explode. It's quite a weird looking attack, but it is quite fun to look at. But yeah, I think that like he is a character that you want more for the future if you want him than right now. Though I do think he'll be useful for a few events more than people think he is. Machichiru says, going in with at least 100 tickets. He's not mandatory by any means, but I value characters with unique niches. Eald'Narche has free turns for turn manipulation and his unique terror debuff that can be quite evil when used in the right situation. He's definitely not for everyone, as he's a more complex character to use. I really like the way his kit changes to an offensive mode when the exit plate's removed. As I already have him purpled and was lucky enough to grab Emperor's Burst from Aerith's banner, I'll be going in with as many tickets as it takes to get his LD. I'm not quite as willing to go all in for Eald'Narche. Like, I would like him because I actually agree with this. I think he's very unique. I think he's very fun to play because he's not somebody that does the same thing a lot. So therefore it does mix things up quite nicely, and because you get the warp debuff on top of the terror, like you can't do anything but I'm going to attack you during the turn you would have taken, it's fun for me. And as someone who wasn't lucky enough to grab Emperor's Burst, it is another opportunity for me to do that. Bragan says, not pulling this time round. Although Eald'Narche looks like a fun character to use, I only have his 15 weapon, and given the fact that Aerith wiped out my gems that I'd picked up from Divine Ramu, I'm needing to save as much as I can. Some big hitters coming soon that I'd much rather have. My roster's really strong right now as well, so time to build those resources back up. Totally fair. Like, you can't pull on everyone. Like, I mean, I try to sometimes, and I really shouldn't. But, you know, you can't pull on everybody if you want to keep hold of some of your resources. So if there's a skippable banner, this one is not mandatory. There's a lot of fun to be had with Eald'Narche, but you don't need him for anything, really. And then finally, Atoy Project said, absolutely pulling with gems. I loved Eld'Narche in FF11 and greatly enjoy his uniqueness of his kit in DFFOO. When it works, it's maniacal, laughter-inducing fun. I totally understand that he's not for everybody, but I enjoy using him and building teams around what he can do. I will be back with gems or even tokens for his burst this summer. His burst is also pretty cool. Like, I mean, the fact that he's got the stats to back up a lot of what he does make a big difference to him. And I enjoy the idea of getting his LD now, so that even if I don't get his burst at the time, it means that the banners that are with Eald'Narche's burst are more appealing, just on the off chance that I can complete a character that I already had built up. And I quite like doing that for future investment. But not everybody will agree with that, and that's completely fair as well. So that's going to be it for today's Should You Pull video on Eald'Narche. Let me know in the comments below whether you plan on pulling for him, or perhaps if you're waiting for his burst, or if you're interested in Noel and you might try and pull for him. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making. And hopefully I will see you next time. Or when I stream this particular event, I can hope to God that perhaps it's a bit more nice to me than the last few have been. Not counting Celes, of course. Anyways, that's going to be it for me. Thank you ever so much, guys, and I'll see you next time. Take care.